All right, perfect. So, welcome everybody to the latest in the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics seminar series. We just ask that everybody mute themselves. If you have questions, there'll be plenty of time at the end, or you can put them into the chat. That's open and monitored. So please feel free to interact. And again, this is our seminar series, USSEE. You can find all our past seminars on our YouTube page under U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join. There's a lot of benefits to it. We do seminars regularly, book clubs. We have a lunch podcast club that we do occasionally. A lot of different activities, a fellows program, um, just a lot of stuff. So, and our webpage is going to be getting redone soon. So I think you'll see a lot of neat stuff coming up in the next month. So please stay engaged. Today's seminar is by Alejandro Agafonow. He's a professor at the ESCA, hopefully I got that right, School of Management in France. And he just recently published a paper in the journal Ecological Economics, and that's what his presentation today is, in search of a non-anthropocentric middle range theory of the firm on how the Patagonia Purpose Trust granted a controlling stake to nature. The paper was very interesting, and I'm almost guarantee you the talk will be as well. So please enjoy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alejandro.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody for being here. There are two reasons why I'm so happy to see you connected. First, because at least in Europe, we are starting our summer vacations, and naturally, many colleagues would prefer to have some time off, but also because of the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Paris, which will begin in an hour and a half. So thanks for being here today. It's a pleasure to bounce off ideas with like-minded colleagues about this subject. So as John mentioned, there you have, that's the paper published recently in Ecological Economics. And my objective today is to share with you what I and my co-author Maribel Perez posited in this paper. Perhaps everybody knows, if you are an ecological economist or are close to the subject matter of ecology, Patagonia has been known during a while already. And my objective is to tell you about recent changes in the corporate structure of the company, that changes that invite us to perhaps rethink the theory of the firm, what an enterprise is, and what are the implications for the supply of ecological services, ecosystem services. So I will start by telling you about those changes in Patagonia. I then will move on to share with you some of the implications of these changes in Patagonia for the theory of the firm. And finally, I will close with some thoughts about methodology that I think are very important for ecological economists. I won't be able to monitor the chat, but of course, John is welcome to jump in and ask any question, as well as the participants of the seminar. I don't see why not having a conversation instead of listening to me during the next 30 minutes or so. So let's move on with these. I would like first to start mentioning that the paper is built, the research was anchored to what Elinor Ostrom called a new institutionalism. As you know, it's a field of a current of thought in economics, nurtured by many different subdisciplines, perhaps transaction cost economics, definitely the economics of commons, as well as property right economics. And I would like to start precisely by sharing with you a definition of property rights by Alchan and Densitz, who are this definition is very important to understand what happened in Patagonia recently. So let me quote Alchan and Densitz. They define property rights as, it is not the resource itself which is owned, they say. It is a bundle or a portion of rights to use a resource that is owned. And they finish saying, what is owned are rights to use resources, including one's body and mind. And these rights are always circumscribed, often by the prohibition of certain actions. And this brings me to the distinction that a legal scholar called Henry Hansman, perhaps you know him, you have read his work, he's also an economist that have made some contributions in the area of nonprofit organizations, and he distinguishes between law as a doctrine and law as having a functional implications over what we do with bundles of property rights. And it is precisely this rather applied functional understanding of law that our paper and our research feeds on. So let me continue by showing to you this image. It's a rather populated slide with a lot of information. I will break it down for you in the next few minutes. This is how the Patagonia today, the company, looks like. And I just would like to bring to your attention the fact of this dual stock structure. Essentially, Patagonia now is structured in a way that the Patagonia Purpose Trust controls 2% of the shares of the company with voting rights, while the other 98% of the shares without voting rights was granted to a nonprofit organization called the Holdfast Collective. And this is what I intend to break down for you, so I can try to communicate what exactly happened, what is the significance of this way of distributing the shares of the company. To understand this better, we need to compare Patagonia with two forms of trusts. Trusts are essentially a template among the many different kinds of organizations, templates that the law offers for us to organize production. Trusts are one of them. And trusts have been receiving quite a bit of attention from ecological economists during a while. You perhaps may remember the paper from Robert Constanza, where Robert Constanza deals with trust, and he's actually one of the ecological economists behind the idea of an Earth atmospheric trust. He, with other colleagues, are proposing the possibility of managing the atmosphere and the ecosystem services that it provides or supplies with a trust. I will not take you there. But my point is that in this aim of having a real world ecological economists have been interested in the possibilities, functional possibilities that trusts offer. And this is why, to understand this picture, this structure of Patagonia, we need to compare it with two fundamental templates before we move on to the specificities of Patagonia. The first template is, of course, the charitable trust. And the second template in question is the non-charitable purpose trust. It is only by understanding how these two templates, what these two templates entail, that we can understand what are the specificities on Patagonia and the virtues, the innovations, the organizational innovations that Patagonia has proposed for our consideration, and the implications for the community of scholars interested in ecology. So let me start by telling you briefly what a charitable trust is and what are the limitations of charitable trust. Again, Patagonia is not a charitable trust. As you can see here, essentially we have a settler here to the left of the screen that essentially donates a certain amount of money. That money will be, of course, managed by a trustee. And that trustee at the same time will rely on a team of professionals to manage that money. Here we have, what is interesting about this is that we have a dual agency relationship. That is to say, the professionals are in principle there to fulfill the mission that the trustees gave to them when managing parts of the operations of the trust. But the trustee at the same time is, and here is the double agency relationship, is supposed to implement or to work in order to fulfill the mission created by the donor, and at the same time be at the service of beneficiaries. And here comes perhaps the first link I illustrated this way, a link that breaks. What are the limitations of charitable trusts? Well, first of all, charitable trusts normally rely on contingent beneficiaries. Think about it. Essentially, we are talking about organizations that foster a charitable mission. Think about the poor. What are the possibilities for the poor to organize themselves and be able to, in a sense, monitor what the trustee is doing, hold the trustee accountable based on the mission that the donor said. They are by definition dispersed, too many. They are concerned with making ends meet. Why? How could they possibly devote time to understand what the trustee in the framework of this charitable trust is supposed to do for them? Consider, for example, nature itself. Nature lacks sanctions. Nature lacks awareness, cannot be organized to actually hold accountable the trustee. And this is a fundamental limit of charitable trust. That is to say, the lack of the contingent nature of beneficiaries, and therefore they lack sufficient interest to seek enforcement and have standing. I illustrate the standing in the courts with this icon here. Of course, this brings us to a second point. Who monitors charitable trust? Well, in the US, it's essentially the state attorney general who monitors non-profit organizations in general, but also a charitable trust. And it's not too different in other countries. We are essentially speaking about a monitor that is far removed from the daily operations of the organization. How could possibly the state attorney general know when if the trustee is actually fulfilling the mission of the donor to the letter, and if the beneficiaries are somehow perhaps satisfied with the way the trustee is managing those assets for the sake of providing a benefits to these contingent beneficiaries? So this is an important limitation when it comes to talking the walk. How can we guarantee that the trustee, which is not the donor, will actually foster that mission? And well, I illustrate with this kind of drone there that fails to monitor what's going on. You may remember, every now and then, actually, there are scandals concerning nonprofits around the world, precisely because of the weaknesses in the monitoring structure, in the accountability structure of nonprofits. You may remember, I saw on the BBC this news. It was 2 weeks ago. Baby saved from traffickers was borrowed by Charity for Photos. It was a charitable organization in the UK that borrowed a baby from a developing country just to set up a whole marketing campaign and justify the money they were using to enrich themselves. Actually, the trafficked child was not saved by this charitable organization, and eventually they were discovered. So these are the weaknesses of the accountability mechanism that we know exist in place in order to hold accountable the trustee. Which brings us to the third link that breaks, essentially the possibility of opportunistic behavior from the trustee. It is true, of course, that there may be a self-selection process, and we have a lot of committed trustees, managers, employees working for well-managed nonprofit organizations. Yet, again, every now and then, like the sample I just brought to your attention, issues of mismanagement of resources are brought to the open, let's say, uncovered by journalists around the world concerning mismanagement of nonprofit organizations. So it's important to keep this in mind because Patagonia actually did something that intends to overcome the limits that I just brought to your attention. Then now let me move to a non-charitable purpose trust, which is the second template that Patagonia had in mind to restructure itself. It is sometimes weird, strange to hear from Europe that a pet suddenly became rich in the US. Have you heard about it in the news? A cat, a dog suddenly inherited an amount of money. For us here in Europe, is difficult to understand what's going on, but yes, it's possible thanks precisely to this legal template, a non-charitable purpose trust. What we are seeing here is essentially a settlor, which is a benefactor, that gives again an amount of money that will be managed by a trustee that essentially is meant to be put to the service of certain kind of objectives. One of those objectives could be caring for a pet, a beloved pet, but not only. These non-charitable purpose trusts are very often used, for example, to take care of the graves of the deceased benefactor, as you can see in the image here to the right of the screen. Or, for example, to maintain the statue created to honor the memory of the benefactor. Essentially, we are talking about objectives that are very, in a sense, self-centered. They are not meant necessarily to profit directly the benefactor, and yet these objectives are there, in a sense, to benefit somehow the benefactor. And this is another link that breaks in the case of the non-charitable purpose trust, because after all, Patagonia is meant to care for the environment. With such a limitation, the non-charitable purpose trust template would not serve as a viable alternative for Patagonia. Yet, we are talking here about a definite or ascertainable beneficiary. Unlike the charitable trust, of course, the beneficiary here is very much identifiable, definite, and may have actually legal standing. This is why we have that sometimes very often in these non-charitable purpose trusts, we have the member of a small class of identifiable beneficiaries that may actually act as monitors of what the trustee is doing. In this particular case, we have a chain that doesn't break, precisely because of the accountability mechanism is stronger than the one we see in charitable trusts, precisely because of the interest members of the family may have in seeing the rather narrow objective to be achieved or fostered. Of course, having an accountability mechanism, a monitoring system in place, rather at least stronger than compared to a charitable trust, the possibility of a trustee misbehaving will be lower. And therefore, the third chain doesn't break in the image. These elements, these building blocks, my objective is now to use them to communicate what did Patagonia achieve. And here comes the story of Patagonia, the recent story of Patagonia. As you can see, perhaps the most evident step in the right direction of Patagonia has been to identify a definite beneficiary. This definite beneficiary is not a pet, is not a statue for the sake of honoring somebody's memory, but actually this definite beneficiary is the Holdfast Collective, which is a non-profit organization, a cousin from a charitable trust that is meant to foster, prevent climate change, use the money that the Holdfast Collective will receive via the 98% of the shares of Patagonia dividends for the sake of investing in projects that tackle, in the best case scenario, reverse, but at least prevent climate change. What we can see here is that two things are important things are combined from an organizational perspective. The definite nature of the beneficiary, together with the more ambitious kind of objective, which is environmental. This is an important breakthrough when it comes to reorganizing Patagonia, while using in a rather creative way, contracting around the templates to use trust in a rather creative way. This brings us to another chain that doesn't break, and it is that given the fact that the Holdfast Collective is a definite beneficiary, definitely it will have standing in the courts in case the trustee misbehaves. The trustee is Patagonia Works, which is the company itself. So the role of the Holdfast Collective will be similar to the successors in interest in the case of the Non-Charitable Purpose Trust, which reinforces the accountability mechanism that we can find in Patagonia today. And logically, this brings us to another chain that doesn't break, which is precisely the fact that the agents or the trustee, the wardens of the mission set by the benefactor, the Chouinard family here to the left of the screen, have imposed or have mandated on this trustee. So opportunism, the possibility of opportunistic behavior that pushes Patagonia Works and its board of directors to mismanage the resources of Patagonia are less likely, let's say, to happen given this structure. There is another layer of complexity to this. Remember that before we were talking about trustees, and here what we see is a directed trustee in the terminology, the legal terminology of the trusts. What we see here is a protracted problem of who monitors the monitor. This is something known in the legal literature we rely on as fractionation of trustship. That is to say, we have a co-trustee, which is precisely the Chouinard family chairing a trust, the trust of the board of trustees of the Patagonia Purpose Trust that is meant to designate and supervise the company Patagonia Works. And therefore, the trustee becomes a directed trustee. So there is a behavioral assumption, of course, behind our belief that this supervisory work will play its magic. That is to say, Patagonia has been known for, despite critics and despite perhaps some scandals, the company has been rather coherent over history. And we can trust, in a sense, it is a behavioral assumption. We can imagine that the family is committed to actually doing business in a way that reduces environmental impact, and in fact, in a way that fosters environmental regeneration in some of its lines of business. So having them, our point is that having them on board in the board of trustees of the trust, supervising, designating who the managers of the Patagonia Works, the company, will be, is actually a step in the right direction in this process of fractionating trustship and trying to find a solution to the problem of who monitors the monitor. So let me wrap up before I take you to the most theoretical part of the research. Patagonia now essentially is not owned by the family anymore. Patagonia now is owned by both a purpose trust that is actually controlled by the family. The purpose trust has 2% of the shares with voting rights, and the lion's share of the shares without voting rights were actually granted to the Holdfast Collective, which is a non-profit organization, an environmental nonprofit organization. The idea is to use the Patagonia Works as a company that keeps trying to do business in a way that is environmentally friendly, but on top of that, produce revenues, net revenues that will be transferred to the Holdfast Collective to tackle climate change. We found this really inspiring and actually novel. It's a way to contract around the templates, the legal templates of trust, to overcome some of the problems we normally see in the management of those trusts. This brings us, of course, to the implications for the theory of the firm. And here, if you were not familiar with trust before, here you will be very much aware of some of the building blocks of the theory behind this research. Essentially, we are talking about, first of all, you may remember, this is a common knowledge. There is a multilateral market contracting understanding of the market, which finds its advocates, of course, in free market economists. That is to say, they see the market as it is the case of markets where negligible entry barriers and low market concentration produce undersized nodes. What are those nodes? Well, they could be individuals, they could be firms, and I'm going to take you to the definition of firms by economists in a moment. The point is that the accumulation of value, the capture of value by those nodes is prevented in principle by the magic of competition. We know what are the limits, of course, of this understanding of the market. But of course, we have also another more, let's say, realistic on this understanding of market contracting. That is to say, market where entry barriers and high market concentration produce oversized nodes. In this case, perfect competition doesn't exist. We will see naturally that there is a tendency for some more successful companies or companies with political connections, perhaps, to accumulate power, market power, and therefore some of those nodes are oversized. But it was actually back to the 1970s that four scholars, Alchan, Densitz, Jensen, and Mecklin, tried to rethink this understanding to make room for firms in economic thinking. So they used this idea of this idea of the nexus of contract, and they construe the firm in this way. That is to say, firm where rent accrues to equity holders in the center, the oversized node, represented by the oversized node, while, of course, the stakeholders, you name it, suppliers, employees, among many others, remain in the periphery of the node, and they have they are less, they accumulate less value than shareholders themselves. What is peculiar about this understanding of the firm is that they did not construe the contractual relationship between the node in the center and the nodes in the periphery as different from a simple market transaction. So to what extent firms are simply an extension of the market by other means is an important question that some economists have been asking themselves to question this way of seeing the firm. Let me share a definition of Densitz, a definition of the firm by Densitz in the 1980s, which is very revelatory of the limits of this understanding of the firm. Densitz said, and I quote, "It is a mistake to confuse the firm of economic theory with its real-world namesake. The chief mission of neoclassical economics is to understand how the price system coordinates the use of resources not to understand the use of resources, not to understand the inner workings of real firms. So is there a theory of the firm, properly speaking, in economics? At least definitely not in the case of these scholars that use the idea of an excess of contract in the way I just shared with you. So it's paradoxical that economists actually do not have, or at least some currents of thought in economics do not have a very sophisticated understanding of the nuts and bolts that move enterprises. This simplification, where the inner workings of the firm do not matter for an economist, as Densetz said in the 1980s, is surprising to many of us. But of course, it was back to the 1970s. We have more elaborate understanding of firms today. Perhaps one of the most important contributions that move our understanding of the firms in the right direction, at least from an empirical point of view, is the perception, the way Oliver Williamson construed the firm. So this is the case of a firm where rent accrues to equity holders and whose demarcated boundaries distinguish it from the market with negligible entry barriers and low concentration. Of course, Oliver Williamson had trust in the magic of competition to play as we discussed before, but his contribution actually is in this demarcation of the boundary between the firm and outside nodes by means of the notion of transaction costs and the governance structures that are likely to reduce or increase those transaction costs. The problem is that still we have equity holders as the oversized node in the perception, in the conception of the firm by Oliver Williamson, however sophisticated his understanding is, which brings us to Koff, who actually made a breakthrough when it comes to understanding that other nodes, not only equity holders, may actually accumulate value and be represented as oversized nodes. So this is the case of firm where rent accrues to stakeholders other than equity holders, represented by oversized nodes. Think about this. In a firm like this, like the one represented by Koff, we are talking about firms where actually equity holders in the center of the picture do not accumulate much power. It means that we are talking about firms perhaps with a very successful business model, with goods or services that are very much sought after, and yet they are not able to turn very handsome profits because other stakeholders have more bargaining power. It could be, for example, the case of OpenAI today. It is well known that the amount of money that paying for human capital, computer scientists to develop ChatGPT and similar large language models is very important. They would be represented as a sort of oversized node in the case of OpenAI. Think about the providers of chips. NVIDIA has been very much on the news lately precisely because of the huge profits they have been turning out of producing chips able to run the heavy large language models that companies like OpenAI are using. So it's a company with a sought-after product that yet is not profitable yet, and tells us something about the importance of understanding bargaining power over and above shareholders. Which brings us to, these are the building blocks we use in the research to propose perhaps a more realistic, in the tradition of ecological economics, a more realistic notion or understanding or conception of the firm. In this case, we have essentially a firm where rent can accrue to internal or external stakeholders, including nature illustrated with white trees, whose demarcated boundaries distinguish it from the market with entry barriers and concentration. So we are not using the idea of nature having a controlling stake simply as a metaphor. Metaphors are very powerful to make breakthroughs in science, of course. You may remember that the atoms discovered by physicists, they did it thanks to a metaphor with billiard balls decades ago. So metaphors can be a first step toward approaching concepts that eventually are discovered to be true thanks to their anchors to reality. And we are not using, in this case, the controlling state to nature as a metaphor only. Actually, the governance structure of Patagonia grants nature indirectly by identifying an ascertainable, definite a beneficiary like the Holfast collective, a sort of bargaining power for the sake of increasing the resources that will be devoted to tackle climate change. That's what we do with these building blocks from the theory of the firm. And I will finish in the next 5 minutes, because this would not be complete if I do not have a word about methodology. What kind of data are we using here? This is what Michael Jensen actually called a qualitative institutional data. Have a look at this. This is a Porphyrian tree or object hierarchy. What is this? Let me read what it says there for you. A tool to classify the instance level parts, entities, or individual denizens of the reality of a field of study. What you can see here, colleagues, is precisely the data, the qualitative institutional data that we used. These are instance level parts which count on a high degree of reliability. Who would deny that there is a board of trustees? Who would deny that Patagonia work has a board of directors with very clear identifiable directors, and so on and so forth? But what is most important, and I continue reading, whether in library catalogs, in restaurant menus, in functional classifications of genes, or in the directory structure used by the operating system of our computers, such sorting is required. Porphyrian trees are actually used in many different fields, and they are a constant methodological tool in biomedical sciences. You may remember this paper from Herman Daly. We discussed it weeks ago in one of the seminars here through this channel on economics of life sciences. Life sciences have been using material ontologies. This is a material ontologies to systematize the units of observation. And perhaps there is a hope that using instance level parts like these may help us advance along the lines of what biomedical sciences have achieved. There is just a step from this to a computational treatment of these instance level parts. Biomedical sciences are already there at the stage of using this way of organizing units of observation to actually use a computational treatment of those units of observation to mix them in the form of mechanisms. And I am arriving to the end of the presentation. What are mechanisms? Well, here you have a definition that is at the very heart of this research. Mechanisms are defined as entities and activities organized to produce a phenomenon. And they exhibit spatial relations and structural features of the entities in the mechanism. Label arrows often represent the activities that produce changes. In these ways, diagrams represent features of mechanisms that could be described verbally, but are more easily apprehended in visual form. And this is just an example of our reconstruction of the mechanism, our building of the mechanism of Patagonia using the instance level parts or units of observation that organizing the Porphyrian tree in the paper in question. I just arrived to the end of the presentation. I would be very, very keen on listening to you, on hearing your reaction.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alejandro. I put your paper into the chat for those who
Mhm.
are interested, and
That's great.
they'll be able to download that from there.
Great.
There is a comment from Eric, and I'll let him go ahead and speak.
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. That was fascinating. And yeah, I was went on the previous, I think it was like a slide or two ago. You had the different columns.
You mean
Number 10, slide
number
number
10?
10.
Okay, number 10. There
Yeah.
we go. Mhm.
Yes. I started to think about, especially when we were talking about cough, when, um, yeah, the benefits the rents are accruing to other stakeholders. It just got me, I started something about it started me thinking about carbon markets and offsets and how the the landowner like the landowners may not be benefiting, but all these other entities that are involved in trading these carbon offsets um, may be the ones that are benefiting. And then, of course, the nature um, is the one that's really losing out. So I don't know, just something I haven't. I'm just all trying to process all of this at this time. That's just what kind of popped into my head, and wonder, have you thought about that at all? If that in fact does apply?
Not in that specific application, but it rings the bell for a reason. COF's stakeholder bargaining power is actually anchored to Ricardo's idea of rent. And essentially, the breakthrough of COF is precisely to go past the point of believing that the only ones able to capture value in the form of residual earnings are shareholders. As the case of OpenAI illustrates, other stakeholders, employees and suppliers included, can actually accumulate a lot of have a lot of bargaining power, and therefore accumulate a lot of rent. And we can use this general framework of other stakeholders accumulating bargaining power in the form of rent beyond for-profit companies in many other different contexts. Perhaps the example that you bring to our attention is pointing in the direction of telling us who is getting the lion's shares of the rent in that particular case. And the important thing is that it opens a door to question what's going on. That's the beauty of these theoretical building blocks. Firms, enterprises are not only there to turn a net revenue, a profit to be distributed in the form of dividends to shareholders. There are ways of reorganizing the bundle of property rights that firms are to get our head around structures that perhaps may be used to benefit other stakeholders, nature included, like the case of Patagonia may perhaps illustrate. We will see what happens in the future, the evolution of this structure. So sorry if I cannot give you more hints, but at least
Yeah, I think this opens a lot of questions and potential avenues for research. So that's exactly what these webinars are all about. So I really appreciate your presentation today.
Thank you, Eric. And I recommend reading the paper of Koff published in Organization Science, if I remember well. You can see the citation in the paper to see the full reference. Conceptually speaking, is a wonderful paper. It helps you, have a different understanding of what's going on.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Give everybody a chance.
Mm-hmm. If I may, just a parenthesis, these organizing units of observation actually count with an ISO standard. There have been, during the last few decades, especially in biomedicine, the efforts to systematize the way we employ units of observation has evolved, and there are many different frameworks. But finally, all those efforts have boiled down into an ISO standard that we may be using. Imagine the implications of standardizing the basics of the methodology to deal with observational studies in ecology. The implications are far-reaching in terms of finally managing to have a level playing field that will pave the way for talking to each other in the same terms. There will be disagreements, of course. Was our interpretation of the mechanism, the way those units of observation connect, the way those denizens of reality connect, can it be improved? Are there disagreements in the ecological community of this account of the way Patagonia is structured? There may be, but at least, and this is a huge breakthrough in the social sciences, at least there is little or no ground to question the units of observation that we are using, because they are there. The sources of the qualitative institutional data leave little room for questioning the reliability of those units of observation. So I would invite colleagues to perhaps build along the lines of this paper from Herman Daly in 1968 on economics as a life science. Of course, he did not deal with material ontologies as we do in this paper, but this is a natural progression in what he suggested as a goal for ecological economists.
I think Eric has another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, if unless I don't want to speak for anybody else, but quick question, just practicality. The Chouinard family is the trustee currently. What happens, if the family dies out? I mean, just from it's a little bit morbid, I guess, but what happens if they don't have any, the next generation doesn't have any heirs as a practical
that's we've been reflecting about it, and I personally believe that this is perhaps part of the beauty of this model. True, Yvon Chouinard, the patriarch of the family, let's call him, he's rather elder, and there are reasons for concern. But we can imagine that the members of the family, the next generation, will be in charge as members of the Board of Trustees of the Patagonia Purpose Trust. And there is perhaps a selfish reason why they may actually be committed to the goal of the whole structure. Imagine the number of conferences that they will be invited to talk about what they have achieved. Imagine many other ways that they can actually profit from the fact that they belong to a family that made a breakthrough when it comes to reorganizing the enterprise in a way that is novel. They will have reasons, perhaps, in the next generation to keep doing their job in the Board of Trustees, because after all, the lion's shares of the dividends will be in the hands of a nonprofit organization. They are bound to transfer that money to the Holtas Collective. So there is a kind of balance here of selfishness and altruism. Yes, are they going to benefit from it? I would like to believe that yes, and it is precisely because of that the structure is likely to survive in the long term.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One of the things that I guess has been tossed around a lot is how we measure the value of these things, of what we're trying to protect, how much is the return on the investments that are made. Does your model account for any of that or anything in that realm, or is this something that takes it in an entirely different direction?
Yes, not at all. We do not intend in the paper at all to say anything about how to value ecosystem services. We are very much aware, and perhaps you are more cognizant of this literature that I am. Is it measurable or not? I will not enter in that debate. But the fact is that we simply pay attention to how a structure may secure the fact that a raincoat will be that clients paying for a raincoat from Patagonia are likely, in a sense, indirectly to buy ecosystem services by means of the care the company put into manufacturing that raincoat with certain care, with certain environmental objectives in mind. Among other things, offering free repairs in order to prevent you buying another raincoat from Patagonia or any other supplier. So in a sense, ecosystem services are being demanded by clients when they decide to patronize Patagonia. And no, we do not delve into the issue of how to actually measure the value associated to those ecosystem services that arguably customers may be buying.
I have maybe a weird thought here, but I'm thinking particularly, it can be applied to pretty much any country, I suppose, but I'm thinking in particular developing countries, let's say Africa, where there's a lot of natural resources. And using this kind of structure to safeguard the resources to make sure they're not overly mined or abused or so forth, and still have protective aspects for the environment. Just your thoughts on that, if I'm completely out in left field, or if this kind of structure could be applicable to something like that.
Is a question that invites an ambitious answer that I do not have. If colleagues would like to jump into this research agenda, an important step in the way to answer the question of John would be actually to compare how trusts are being used around the world to achieve environmental objectives. And we know that they are the case of Robert Constanza and the atmospheric trust that he is promoting is an example. But there are, of course, trusts in New Zealand, in Costa Rica, in the US. Trusts are being used also to achieve environmental goals, only that perhaps in a different fashion, with a different configuration of the bundle of property rights that you can see in the case of Patagonia. Is there a hope to actually finally come up with a sort of template of a firm that ecological economies may endorse, because we are rather sure that this configuration is likely to prevent the negative externalities conventional for-profit corporations are producing? I don't know. I don't know the answer for that. But that definitely is a question worth researching.
Are there any other comments or questions? Do you have any last thoughts or comments, Alejandro?
Yes, there are critics of the Chouinard family. Why? And this is an issue. This brings me to a colleague that is online, Mike Hottinger. He's from Germany. He brought it up to my attention. He's on the media. The Chouinard family, of course, enjoys some tax breaks out of moving in this direction. And it's an important political philosophy question. I mean, are we gonna leave wealthy people to keep deciding what to do with their money, preventing to pay taxes? I don't see avoiding, because it's totally legal, preventing to pay taxes for them to decide what that money what kind of uses that money will be put, to what kind of services that money will be used. It's a very important political philosophy question, yes. Yet, my point is that the Chouinard family actually had to relinquish a part of the tax breaks that they would have enjoyed if they simply sold the company and donated the money to charity. By means of actually creating this purpose trust, they had to relinquish a much more handsome benefits associated to larger tax breaks by simply donating selling the company and donating this money to charity. Why they didn't do it? Well, Yvon Chouinard has been explicit about it. He says that that would have been perhaps a disaster, that would have prevented, who knows what would have happened with Patagonia after all. So he wanted to preserve what the company is, the reputation it's built during decades concerning positive environmental impact, and put it into a framework that perhaps secured its future into that objective, in that direction. But yes, they got tax breaks. They enjoy tax breaks out of doing this. Why not paying the taxes? Why not letting the government, democratically elected government, to decide what to do with that money? That's a very important question.
All right. Well, thank you very much for just a very interesting seminar. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And again, the paper is in the chat if anybody would like to download it, and you can contact Alejandro, I'm sure, with any questions you might have. And really want to thank you again, and look forward to seeing everybody at our next seminars, which you'll get announcements as we schedule them. So thank you again.
A pleasure. Bye-bye. See you soon.